Welcome, listeners, to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, brought to you by EliteForm.com. This is Jared Cohen-Stark, today with Chris Gaviglio. How are you doing today, Chris?
Good, Jared. You well?
I'm pretty well. We're looking at the article, The Effects of Different Pre-Game Motivational Interventions on Athlete-Free Hormonal State and Subsequent Performance in Professional Rugby Union Matches, written by Christian Cook and Blair Crewther. What were they looking at in this study, Chris?
Looking at the sport of rugby union, or most sports actually, when you think about prior to a match, they would traditionally have the coach get up there and do some form of pre-match talk, possibly use some vision to go through the gameplay that they're going to go through their opposition, things that they really want to work on, and individual things that they possibly want the athlete to focus on during the game.
Right, you'd watch any sports movie and at some point there's going to be a massive pep talk by the coach, and from how the plot of the movie is designed, that is the reason that they win, is because of the incredible pep talk from the coach that motivates the players to perform beyond the possible.
Definitely. And when you look at a lot of Christian Cook's work and some of my own work as well, they've found that athlete motivation during sports competition may be related to some extent the effects of endogenous testosterone on the brain. So in other sports, they've actually found that aggressive behaviours such as offensive moves in combat sports such as judo correlates well to increases in testosterone levels. And greater testosterone increases have also been observed in winners than losers during physical but also non-physical competitions. Furthermore, when you look at elevations in testosterone concentrations, it's also been demonstrated by athletes playing at their home ground. So we mentioned in a previous podcast, if you play at home, you want to defend your territory, so your testosterone concentrations are traditionally higher versus playing away from home where they'll be lower because you're going to someone else's territory or their enemy or the enemy's territory.
Right, it's very territorial dominating.
Definitely. The Christian's group, and also there's been a couple of other general studies as well, have looked at how different video footage can affect testosterone concentrations, and with this acutely modified testosterone, how their approach to a performance task may have also changed. So subsequent aggression, motivation to perform, and therefore physical performance have been shown to change acutely with testosterone concentrations. And also this has been really the effect of the video footage that they've been shown at the time. So they're really bringing in previous research around how acute video footage can affect testosterone concentrations, but brought it more into a practical context prior to a game.
And this relates quite strongly to that other article we did on the different videos that you watch.
Definitely.
Different types of videos that you can watch beforehand, whether that's aggressive videos or sad videos, and the different effects that those have on the athletes.
And that one it was squat performance, and this one here, it's actually a sporting performance, really applicable to a team.
Right, so moving from a training environment to a competitive match environment.
Correct.
So you mentioned the video footage. What are the other methods for eliciting those changes?
The other main one here is the language of the coach, or verbal persuasion is another word. As we all know, verbal persuasion, the motivation from the coach is something that can drive one's motivation for action. Some data has actually suggested that testosterone might be enhanced.
Right, and we've seen that a lot in a lot of the feedback that coaches give athletes while they're training or during the game. And particularly, I think everyone has really experienced that when you're going for a big lift or a performance and the people around you are cheering for you and pushing you to perform, it does make you perform better.
Yeah, and when you're acutely aware of the language of a coach or someone who's motivating you, what they're actually saying, whether it's positive or negative, by just changing how you put the message forward, such as, Jared, you're looking great today, just make sure you take a good left step on that guy there, as opposed to something which is more cautionary, such as, just watch for your opponent because, mate, he knows about your left step. It really changes your feelings immediately, and it's been shown that kind of language can therefore have that effect hormonally, and they're actually starting to piece these two concepts together once again in this pragmatic type fashion.
And what are other things that can affect the response of the testosterone and how that affects the behavior?
So cortisol is the other marker that can affect this. They have like an antagonistic type response. So we've seen in a lot of studies out there that people with higher Cs, people with higher cortisol concentrations will tend to have a corresponding decrement in testosterone concentration. Therefore, these types of stresses that may be associated with increases in cortisol concentrations may have an corresponding effect on testosterone.
So by looking at both testosterone and cortisol, we can get very good markers of readiness.
Definitely. And you just get a clearer picture as well. In other studies out there, they've actually shown that the testosterone to cortisol ratio has actually been shown to be a marker of readiness as well. So we're taking two markers and you're actually able to combine them for a third marker of sort to really get a better picture of the readiness of the athlete.
Yeah, and what we call that is the dual hormone hypothesis. If you want to look more into that, it relates to how both testosterone and cortisol affect the frontal lobe and the amygdala of the brain to regulate those rational and emotional desires. Moving into the methods, how did they go about designing the study?
This study was conducted across 5 consecutive games during a competitive rugby season. So in the first 3 matches, they used 3 pre-game motivational interventions. In this, they used a video with positive coach feedback. The second one was a video with cautionary coach feedback. And the third intervention was just self-motivation. So in this, a positive coach feedback, where they sit in front of a computer screen for 15 minutes and they watch footage of themselves performing 2 successful plan executions from the game played from the previous week. The coach was also present during this viewing and provided scripted commentary. In this, the coach would affirm the positive actions of each player and the strength of this action on the game in a very simple manner. So as I said to you before, the coach's script may have consisted choosing one of several key phases such as, you performed that well, or that's how I want you to do it. The cautionary feedback, once again, they would sit in front of the computer screen for about 15 minutes and they'd watch footage of their opposing player performing 2 successful plan executions. So here it's someone else versus the positive, it's internalized, it's yourself. So during the watching of these clips, the coach provided scripted comments with phrases such as, don't let him get away with that today. Watch out him for doing that. So you see that's putting that negative connotation onto the player. So you're thinking about not what you have to do as a skilled execution, but you're worrying more about the opposition. And the self-motivation was sitting in a room with no video footage, no coach, but they would either just quietly meditate or listen to music if they wanted to. And as we all know, most athletes, and these athletes did choose to listen to music.
All athletes.
All athletes.
And do you know if there were any notes on what type of music they listened to?
No.
Right, because it would be very different. Quietly meditating would be similar to listening to Jack Johnson, but listening to Guns N' Roses or Metallica would be a very different type of meditation.
Definitely. And what we've found with a lot of this hormonal work is that it's really individualized, even with strength training protocols. You would therefore think that they would listen to music that they feel is beneficial to their performance. So potentially, whether it was Jack Johnson or whether it was Guns N' Roses, it may actually just had a positive benefit because they wanted to listen to it.
Right, and that reflects well on autoregulation, where perhaps an athlete has too much physiological arousal and they need to bring themselves down a little bit for the game, as opposed to an athlete who needs to pump themselves up for the game.
And if you have an experienced athlete, they'd be able to self-regulate.
Absolutely. And these were clearly experienced athletes. There were 12 rugby union players recruited from Swansea University Rugby. So quite good. Big boys, about 100 kilos, 185 centimeters. These are quite good rugby players.
Yeah, that's right. And what they actually did with the experimental procedure, they wanted to repeat it twice again. But when you actually read it, they only did the self-motivation and the positive coach feedback twice. The reason why is the coaches thought that possibly the cautionary feedback may have had a negative impact on their performance. Therefore, they really didn't want that to be repeated twice in case it actually had an actual effect on game outcome.
And that's a good balance of academic control versus practical application.
The other information they gathered was game KPIs. In this case, it was game performance, and it was assessed by 2 subjective outcomes for each player across the 5 games, where a score of 1, or best performance, where a score of 1 to 5 was given according to the performance, where 1 was best performance, all the way up to 5, which is worst performance. So the first measure was a key performance indicator based upon 2 coach-identified skills according to the player positional requirements. So for example, in a forward would be a line-out win and ruck clears, whereas a back might be the number of ball carries over the advantage line. The second measure was an overall performance indicator, or an OPI, during each game with 2 coaches, so in this case the head coach and the assistant, and also was assisted by the game statistician. And this was used And this rating was based on several factors, including the opposition and venue, the abilities of the team and their work rate within each game, adherence to game plan, errors and penalties conceded.
Then for the hormones, to collect testosterone and cortisol concentration, saliva was used, which we very strongly support. There's no real reason to be using blood, especially in this environment, which can be causing harm to athletes which highly value their blood vessels in their elbows, which will be undergoing quite a bit of force in the match. So saliva is a great use. It's easy to comply with, low invasiveness, and has a great ability to track the hormones. What'd they find, Chris?
For both times that they did the self-motivation and also the video with the positive coach feedback, they all promoted significant relative increases in testosterone concentrations before each game. But as we would probably surmise, that the cautionary feedback approach had no significant effect on testosterone. So further testing also revealed a significant treatment effect on testosterone responsiveness, and post-hoc testing indicated the magnitude of the T responses varied between the approaches. Both the positive coach feedback was greater than the self-motivation in both occasions, which was greater than the cautionary feedback. So therefore, this really takes into effect the role that the coach has in delivering the message, and that the vision that we actually give to the athletes has great importance. So both the vision and the message combined together has much greater power than leaving the athlete alone to motivate themselves.
So positive feedback from the coach is the most effective intervention in this case, and cautionary feedback is just not beneficial.
No, definitely not. And when you look at the KPIs that they actually used, we say once again, 1 was best performance, 5 was worst. That the positive coach feedback on both occasions gave better player KPI ratings, and the cautionary feedback had the worst ratings of about 5. Talking about cortisol, cautionary feedback and self-motivation interventions all promoted significant relative increases in cortisol concentrations, but no significant cortisol changes occurred in response to the positive coach's feedback. A positive treatment effect was identified for cortisol responsiveness, and the relative increase in cortisol levels following the cautionary feedback intervention was significantly greater than all other pre-game motivational approaches. So once again, bringing in that dual hormonal hypothesis, we're seeing here a classic example of this. Cortisol's up, testosterone goes.
Right, and there's about a 20% increase in the cortisol with the cautionary feedback. That's quite a bump. It would overcome the full 20% reduction seen from the detraining.
Isn't that amazing?
In our previous article, yeah.
Isn't that amazing? And we will look at the KPI ratings, once again remembering that 1 is a good performance or 5 is a poor performance. That we saw similarly with the testosterone, that the 2 positive coach feedback strategies produced significantly better KPI results, so they scored about 1.5 to 1.8, than the cautionary feedback at 4.8. This was also greater than the self-motivating results, where they were looking at 3.3 to 3.7 for their score. The effects of motivational treatments on player overall performance indicator ratings was also significant, where the 2 positive coach feedback and the 2 self-motivating interventions both produced better OPI results than the cautionary feedback. Just to refresh you there, the key performance indicator was based upon 2 skills. So a forward would be 2 skills such as a line-out win and a ruck clear, and the backs it would be number of ball carries and advantage line. Whereas an OPI, an overall performance indicator, took a lot more things into account, such as the opposition, the venue, the abilities of the team, and their work rate.
So that's it for the hormone concentrations and the performance indicators. What are some final conclusions that we can pull out of this paper?
The big take home here is that if you have positive coach feedback with the right kind of vision, it's going to improve your testosterone concentrations, or it's going to be reflected by greater testosterone concentrations, which is also reflected by better performance. So it really sets up the hormonal system within the body, which is reflected in the better performance.
The things we say to each other affect each other.
One thing that they state here is that this is no more than a correlation, and it doesn't necessarily support a notion of causality between the hormonal changes observed and competitive performance. However, I've got to say there's just a plethora of information out there where this is just a fantastic marker. Testosterone and cortisol and or the TC ratio as a whole is really indicative of good performance and player readiness in athletes.
Right, and if you look at those agents as causative markers, the way to do that is pharmacology, which is then criticized for being a pharmacological intervention rather than an internal transient change. So there's no way to really establish that yet. And this is some of the best evidence that can be created in terms of how effective are these markers for determining this outcome.
Yeah, correct. And when we just look at, as a coach, our processes on game day, what do we do and how that has an ongoing effect for players, it makes sense when we read it. But I think in reflection, do we look into our own environment and our own practices, and do we actually implement what we're actually seeing here into our actual own day-to-day craft? So the big one here is just about the importance of pre-game environment and simple psychological strategies to modify the hormonal and performance outcomes in elite sport. Time and time again, this group has really shown that this type of simple research has great application in the real world with elite athletes.
Thank you, Chris. This has been Snippit Sports Science Podcast with Jared Coleman-Stark and Chris Gaviglio, sponsored by EliteForm.com. Visit our website, visit our sponsor, follow us on Twitter. Please engage. Bye.
See ya.